Darren, do I need to take a screenshot of you on here?
No.
But I think I will anyway. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's about time, give or take a minute or so. And so I'd like to welcome you to this evening session of the Arkansas Historical Association's annual conference. My name is David Ware of the Arkansas State Archives, and I'll be your moderator this evening with my colleague and teacher and friend Lisa Spear, actually making sure that we don't get sent off into the cyber nothingness out there. They know very well, don't give me any controls that have an electronic function. I have some announcements to make before we begin our session this evening. First off, at the end of this session, you'll be, as you log out or as you leave the meeting, you'll be sent a survey. Please take a moment to, in fact, fill out the survey, submit it to us. This is important so that we can tell how well things are going, so that we can keep faith with the organization, especially the Arkansas Humanities Council, who support this endeavor. Remind you that our first session tomorrow is at noon, and there's still time to sign up for it. And also, in terms of questions, if you will submit questions in the chat column, I will give them to the respective speakers at the end of their programs. My job as the moderator is to actually get them to the proper panelists, and we'll do as many as we have time for. So, with that said, I think that I have finished that portion of the program. Let me start by introducing you to the topic and to the panelists. Tonight's session deals with one of the great stocks in trade of the state archives, newspapers. That is, in particular, newspapers that give voice to underrepresented or perhaps anticipated or unsuspected groups in Arkansas's population. Now, here at the archives, we make a lot of our microfilm collection of Arkansas journalism. We have probably the largest such collection extant today. Most newspapers are general interest community papers, so as to appeal to the broadest possible audience. Be they weeklies or dailies, they cover the whole community. But some newspapers issue from and address the concerns of specific portions of the population. And we will hear of these this evening. We will also hear of the Arkansas State Archives' work to make this information more available to the public by collection, preservation, and by dissemination. My three colleagues who will speak tonight come from different backgrounds. They have different duties and research interests, but they are united by their skill and determination in preservation and dissemination of the historical record. Each of them knows much, much more about their topic than I do. And I'm very lucky to be able to call them all my colleagues. In order of presentation this evening, they are Catherine Adkins. Katie currently works as an archivist for the Arkansas State Archives, where she has been project manager for the National Digital Newspaper Program since 2020. Before that, she worked as a curator in a large art gallery in the Upper Midwest. She is a native of Atlanta. She graduated from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's of business, and later she pursued a master's of photography from the Savannah College of Art and Design. Our second presenter, Brian Irby, who many of you heard earlier today, has been on the staff of the State Archives since 2008. He earned his MA in history from the University of Central Arkansas, and in a few weeks, he will become a genuine double dipper. He will complete his master's in library science from the University of North Texas. He lives with his wife, 2 dogs, and 2 cats, plus I understand a few guitars, in North Little Rock. Our third presenter, Darren Bell, preserves Arkansas publications and historically significant records on microfilm and other media here at the State Archives. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science from Ouachita Baptist University and his Master of Arts from Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau in history with an emphasis in historic preservation. Besides his archival work, Darren has scholarly interests in the history of Arkansas, of the Ozarks region, as well as their built and urban environments. First on the bill tonight, Katie Adkins. Katie, it's time for you to unmute.
I am unmuted. Give me a second to get this going. Okay. How's that look? Can't hear you, David.
Looks good, Katie.
Okay, great. Thank you, David, for the introduction. My name is Katie Adkins. I am project manager for the National Digital Newspaper Program, what we call NDNP, which simply means that I manage the day-to-day logistics of digitizing Arkansas's historic newspapers, which I will spare you the details on, though you can ask me later if you're interested. Today, I wanted to share with you what the National Digital Newspaper Program is and how it is giving voice to underrepresented communities by talking about 2 women-owned, women-operated newspapers in Little Rock and the significance of hearing directly from women during the late 1800s. I will also be emphasizing how that affects our understanding of past events and why it is vital to the telling of a more well-rounded narrative of history. I'll talk briefly about how they came about, I'll talk briefly about how the papers came about, the editors and how their backgrounds directly influenced the content of the papers, and some examples of that content, as well as a little bit about where to find all the newspapers we are digitizing. First of all, let me mention briefly that the National Digital Newspaper Program is a partnership between the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize historic newspapers from all 50 states and US territories. Once digitized, these papers can be easily searched on Chronicling America for free. As a state partner of this project, the Arkansas State Archives has been managing this effort since 2017. It is through this project that we're able to digitize important titles such as these, which we will talk about today. In 1884, Mary Loughborough started a small women's section in an already existing Little Rock newspaper, the Rural and Workman. At the time that she started the paper, she was a single parent, a widow with 4 children. Her section of the paper covered women's interests and included articles about politics, fashion, and education, and it emphasized current news with a focus on women. Very quickly, within that same year, this women's section expanded beyond the Rural and Workman, and Mary started the first women's newspaper in Arkansas, the standalone Little Rock Ladies Journal. The title of the paper changed after only a handful of issues to become the Arkansas Ladies Journal. As interest started to spread beyond the borders of Arkansas, the name changed one more time to reflect this larger audience and became the Southern Ladies Journal. Tragically, the Southern Ladies Journal was short-lived. Mary died suddenly and the newspaper folded without her leadership. A year later, a very socially connected and politically active woman, Kate Cunningham, picked up where Mary left off. And she began the Woman's Chronicle, which was a similar for women by women weekly newspaper covering education and politics, but with more emphasis on the temperance and suffrage movements. Her paper lasted 5 years until she also became ill, and like with the Ladies' Journal, the paper folded without her at the helm. One of the most important aspects of having a specialized newspapers, in this case focused on women, is that we are hearing directly from the group themselves, a first-person narrative. Coincidentally, Kate Cunningham emphasizes this exact point in her debut issue of the Woman's Chronicle in 1888, saying, quote, "The paper designs to be the reflex of the real life and spirit of this grand old state, not as an outsider sees it, but as we see it who are of it," end quote. We are the outsiders, and in looking back over 130 years, we would not have a complete picture of the life of women during this time period if we did not hear it directly from those that, quote, "are of it." In Little Rock, from 1884 to 1893, minus about a year, we have direct access to the thoughts and opinions and the issues that were important to women, the stories they told, and the struggles they faced. Let me stop and give an obvious disclaimer here. The more that I researched Mary and Kate, the the more aware I became that they were traveling in certain social circles that not all women, especially women of color, were a part of. So what we are reading is clearly not the story of all women during this period, but it is a story, and it is a story not told by the white male perspective newspapers, which was so typically the case during this time period. While Mary and Kate are not the first women to work in newspapers, what sets them apart from other women working as editors and writers is that their newspapers were entirely dedicated to women. Perhaps even more important than that, though, is that the success of these newspapers was a direct result of the lives that Mary and Kate led outside of the newspaper business. Prior to starting their publications, both Mary and Kate were very active in social issues and politics, as were many of their staff of women writers. Mary was already an accomplished author by the time she started her paper. While married to her husband, a Confederate colonel during the Civil War, they were living in Vicksburg, Mississippi during the famous siege of Vicksburg, and her account of that experience is still one of the most referenced accounts of that event. Prior to the war, her husband had been an attorney, and after his time in the Army, he became involved in railroad land procurement and later politics, serving in the Arkansas legislature and becoming an advisor to Governor Garland. Kate Cunningham grew up as part of a prominent family with family connections to the Claremont Plantation in Alexandria, Virginia, home of founding father George Mason. Her father was a judge and a nominee for Vice President of the United States in 1888, and her mother was an outspoken suffragist. Both women used their newspaper platforms as a way of inserting themselves into the conversation, which at the time was limited to white men. Though they were not necessarily the face of all women, they did promote the idea that women should have a seat at the table, and their newspapers reflected these views. Now that you have a bit of background as to who these women were and how their personal lives were interconnected with their roles as editors, let's take a look at some of the content from the newspapers themselves. After separating from its origins in the Rural and Workman, the Arkansas Ladies Journal expanded to a 4-page issue printed once a week. This standalone paper kept elements of the original publication with sections including house and home, fashion and cooking school, and covering more stereotypical topics that would have been relevant to women at the time. All of this sounds very innocuous, but interspersed within these standard and somewhat traditional sections each week were more pointed articles and unapologetic editorials about local and national news items. For example, in the October 18, 1884 issue of the Ladies Journal, there's a small article reporting on a local woman who was walking down Main Street when a large plank from a construction site was dropped on her head, causing serious injury. Rather than simply reporting the news that Miss Sophia Crease was injured while walking in downtown Little Rock, Mary saw an opportunity to reprimand the city on the state of its streets, furthering this idea that not only do women have opinions on the topic of local politics, but that they should be involved in the discussions. About this issue, Mary says, quote, "This is certainly a piece of carelessness that should be looked into. Our streets are bad enough with the debris of buildings, lumber, etc. But when it comes to narrowly escaping death from planks recklessly thrown from such buildings, passers-by are very far from safe in walking the city streets. Taxpayers certainly deserve a better fate from the city they maintain." End quote. Mary publicly berates, without directly calling them out, the local politicians in charge of taking care of downtown streets and calling on them to do better. In this next example, Mary goes beyond simple beratement of local officials to comment on the inferior position of women in the celebration of President Grover Cleveland. On November 15, Mary writes, "The city is in a great state of excitement over the election of Cleveland. Speeches, high jubilees, and gay times are in order. We ladies who have not political weight enough to be valuable in any position where income is concerned, save perhaps the position of taxpayers, we can at least rejoice with our fathers and sons in their triumphs." Leading up to the 1884 World Cotton Centennial, a World's Fair held in New Orleans in December, There were many articles reporting on the upcoming event, including this one, which reports on the Arkansas legislature's allotment of $5,000 for exhibition costs at the fair. Mary says, quote, "For a frequent verdict has been pronounced regarding women. They are frivolous. They love certain vanities and excitements. They seldom hold to an enterprise or carry any work to completion. And are we not received in the body politic as dependents, as individuals who according to law must be maintained by somebody," end quote. She ends this article by saying, "May we murmur this letter solo voce and then beg pardon for our little topic." Time and again, we see Mary reporting on legitimate news items while simultaneously adding her own justified, sometimes sarcastic remarks and asides, further demonstrating that the women of this time, while not included in politics, had much to say regarding the topic. The Ladies' Journal was a platform under the guise of a newspaper to empower women, push social and political agendas, to occasionally self-promote, and to learn how to paradoxically maintain a home while fighting for equal representation. Though the Arkansas Ladies' Journal was the first women's newspaper in Arkansas, it was merely a toe dip into the lukewarm waters of female empowerment compared to the Woman's Chronicle, which was more of a cannonball leap into the socially and politically male-dominated, dare I say, shark-infested waters that are Little Rock politics during this period. Kate Cunningham and her 2 associate editors came out in full force, leaving no question as to their progressive views on women's issues, their stance on politics, education, and even sometimes religion. While it was stated in the salutatory in the debut issue of Woman's Chronicle that the reason for the paper was solely a motivation to make money and then to make some more, the paper was so much more rich in content than it ever was successful in money. While the Chronicle acknowledged the paths paved by Mary Loughborough and the Ladies' Journal, it is pretty clear that this paper, with Kate as editor, is on a mission, more so than just making money, one that will push the bounds of acceptable female niceties and draw a line in the sand between those that are content and those looking to make a difference. In addition to a much more aggressive stance on issues, the Woman's Chronicle becomes an extension of the temperance and suffragist movements. The paper becomes the official publication of the Arkansas Women's Christian Temperance Union in May 1889. And in case you are wondering how the paper was received during this time, I have a quote up here from a September 1888 issue where Kate is responding directly to a prominent local clergyman of Little Rock who criticizes the Chronicle for being, quote, "too advanced." As you can see, Kate essentially says, if being too advanced means promoting the thoughts of women and advocating for justice for women, that she sees this as a win for the Chronicle. Humor, sarcasm, and pointed observations about the inequities women faced, along with a touch of Southern Belle charm, gave these 2 newspapers a perhaps slightly disarming approach at the real issues that women faced and the very real stand they were taking to promote their ideologies. For nearly a decade, the women of Little Rock had a specialized niche newspaper that was dedicated entirely to women's interests. And what is significant to me is not only was it covering women's interests, but the commentary from the writers, predominantly the editors, was uniquely progressive for the time. While I've barely scratched the surface on the content within these 2 papers, there are many more stories to be told about the editors and their staff of all-female writers, some who carry significant names, but also the people and events they covered and how that fits into the current narrative of the history of women in Arkansas. So coming back to where we began with the National Digital Newspaper Program, these 2 newspapers and the important perspectives of women in the late 1800s would lay dormant, waiting for a researcher to pull out the reels of microfilm from the archives collection, if not for the NDNP project. In my research for this presentation, I spent hours slowly winding microfilm by hand, looking for interesting subjects, quotes, people, and events, all the while thinking about how much more efficient and effective this would be Were the issues already digitized and online? Preparation for this presentation gave me the perfect reminder of why my team and I are doing what we're doing and why digitization of newspapers is invaluable and is the future of research. Luckily for those of you inspired by my presentation to look at the Arkansas Ladies Journal and the Woman's Chronicle, these newspapers are currently being digitized and in a matter of months will be easily searchable on Chronicling America using keyword, date range, newspaper title, and location-specific searches. This will allow you easier access to the information, searching more directly and accurately, and in much less time. Chronicling America is the Library of Congress website where all of the newspapers we are digitizing as part of this project are located. It is a vast database of historic newspapers from all 50 states and territories, currently with over 19.5 million pages available for research. As you can see, Arkansas has digitized a lot of content over the last 4 years, over 200,000 pages, and we are continuing to add content as we speak. To see all of the newspapers that are already up on Chronicling America, you can do a search by state, which will then allow you to see which titles have been digitized. As new content is put up online, we will announce them on our social media pages. Follow us, the Arkansas State Archives, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for announcements about the project, including new content, as well as fun articles we find along the way. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the session. You can ask me about NDNP, Chronicling America, newspaper digitization, and Mary and Kate and their newspapers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Katie. And next up is Brian Irby.
Okay, give me 1 second here. I cannot start my video. Perhaps I'll just share. Okay, let's do this here. There we go. You can all see me. Okay, let me here. I'm going to share my screen and away we go. So thanks, Katie. As we're moving into our third cycle of this NDNP grant that she was talking about earlier, our goal has been to focus on underrepresented communities. And this has been difficult, however, because we've noticed that there's a scarcity of Black-owned newspapers surviving in our collections. Much of this is the result of neglect by our archival communities in collecting Black newspapers. And this is why I'm going to appeal to you tonight to help us preserve history by helping us find some of the Black-owned newspapers that have been lost. Our press reflects us. We look to newspaper coverage of an event, not just to gather facts about an event, but also to understand what people thought about that event. Likewise, reading African-American newspapers gives us an insight into the Black community at a time when the white press was not necessarily covering it at all. When sources are lost, history is distorted. And we historians can only report what the evidence gives us. And many of these gaps are the result of historic racism that's pervaded our archival institutions. Black voices were not sought as important to the history of Arkansas and were excluded. This blind spot has left gaps in our collections that we historians in the 21st century have difficulty bridging. Arkansas's archival institutions, including my own, have only a smattering of information about the Black community from 100 years ago. Archives only hold a tiny portion of material, for instance, regarding Scipio Jones, who was the most prominent African-American of his time. We historians have struggled to find ways to tell these vital stories. There are gaps that are filled by national newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender. We know that this paper circulated in the African-American communities, so much so that the Arkansas legislature, fearful that the paper would cause uprisings in the Black community, tried to ban the paper from being read. Additionally, the Chicago Defender reporters came under attack from white mobs in the state. Now, what made the Chicago Defender so transgressive? For one, the reporting is often at variance with the reporting in the white newspapers. In 1920, the mayor of Pine Bluff called for the paper to be banned. The alleged crime of the Defender was how it reported the death of George Vick. The white press reported that Vick attacked and killed a city detective, C.C. Lynn, and shot several other people. Who were trying to arrest Vick. Chicago Defender reported that a white mob had shown up at Vick's house and set it on fire, causing Vick to begin shooting at the mob in order to protect his home. This kind of reporting, so said the Pine Bluff mayor, is, quote, intended to stir up race trouble and hatred and cause rebellion against the law and officers. This is one of several examples of reporting in the Chicago Defender that caused a stir, mostly because it strayed from the accepted narrative. We know that the Chicago Defender was widely read in the Black community of Arkansas. This alone is valuable and shows what type of news was being consumed by Arkansas's African Americans. But the element that is missing from the Chicago Defender is that it did not cover local community news. This means that the daily workabout lives of African Americans were not covered. It's missing. For instance, here is the Forest City Herald, a newspaper of which we only have a few issues. On March 7th, 1896, it happily reported the following news. The Bible Circle of the CME Church in Forest City was well attended and many attendees had good thoughts about its scripture reading. Meanwhile, Miss Annie B. Fitzpatrick has made many warm friends while visiting Forest City schools. Eugenia Bell is a teacher and expected to teach in one of the schools soon. These were small details that give you a flavor of the day-to-day life in the Black community of Forest City, a community that was mostly invisible to the white press. What all this boils down to is a fundamental question of how we know what we know about the past. Anyone who's gone through a research seminar in a history program learns about Leopold von Ranke in scientific history. We learned that to know anything about the past, we're tied to the primary sources. Anything else is rank speculation. The problem is that we know that there are gaps in the history and that these gaps have a distorting effect on our picture of the past. Let me offer an example. Much of the surviving local reporting on the Lane massacre, as far as what has survived, is from the white-owned press. As a result, headlines have survived that offer a skewed vision of the events that occurred that fall in Phillips County. For instance, the Hot Springs New Era declared prisoners declared it was their intention to take over the land by force to work it for themselves. Likewise, the Arkansas Democrat echoed with Negroes had plot to rise against whites charged. Shooting of officers from ambush started wholesale killings. All Negroes said to have been armed. Luckily, there are some sources from outside the state that can provide a different view of the events. Ida B. Wells Barnett visited Elaine to investigate the incident, and what she reported was quite different from than how the press covered the event. She covered things that were largely missing from the white press's coverage, namely that African-American farmers had been swindled for years and wanted to organize. This alarmed white farmers and landowners, which led to the conflict, and in fact, white law enforcement shot first. This was not found in any of the white coverage, but we know this to be closer to the truth than what the white press said. A more recent analogy can be said about the coverage of the civil rights movement as covered by Little Rock's Arkansas State Press, a newspaper run by activists L.C. and Daisy Bates. Their coverage beginning in the 1940s up through 1959 was a unique view of the movement in Arkansas. Daisy Bates had a personal relationship with the students who were integrating Central High during the crisis. We are proud to be including this newspaper in our third cycle, and this will also be on Chronicling America in the next year. Other than this differing interpretation of news, what else is lost? When looking at the sole surviving Black paper from the height of Reconstruction, we learned that politics was not a monolith. There was much nuance in the thinking of Black Arkansans. The Arkansas Freeman, a paper of which we have one issue, revealed much about the Republican Party in Arkansas in the 1860s. For instance, in the issue available at the State Archives, Tabbs Gross, the paper's editor, argued that African Americans were being underserved by both the Republican Party and the party's newspaper, the Morning Republican. Gross wrote, "They love the colored people, or at least they appear to love them so far as professions go, simply because through their voices, they are put and kept in good paying offices." Many of the existing newspapers we have at the Arkansas State Archives are short runs. For instance, there's the Royal Messenger, a newspaper run by the Supreme Royal Circle of Friends of the World, a Black fraternal organization from Helena. We have one issue of this paper, but we are sure there are more out there. The paper contains stories about members of the fraternity, as well as fraternity business. It's also a glimpse into Helena's Black community. So how is it that we know the names of these lost newspapers? There's a list of newspapers I've been able to identify based on a number of different techniques. The easiest way to identify lost newspapers is to scan through newspapers that exist. In the 19th century through the early 20th century, newspapers would reprint columns or news stories that appeared in other papers, often with a credit at the end, or perhaps they would print a story about another paper. This is how we learned of the existence of the Wabaseka Journal you see on the left hand of your screen. Another way is to look for mentions of newspaper openings and editors starting and closing newspapers. Here's an example of such an article. This article from the Pine Bluff Daily Graphic mentions that Reverend J.G. Robinson was opening a paper, but unfortunately it doesn't give the title. Not all of these techniques are perfect. Newspapers can easily slip noticed in our coverage. There are likely several newspapers that were not mentioned in these sources, and this leaves us at a disadvantage. Another technique is to look through city directories with the hopes that any African-American newspapers would be labeled as such in the entry. We're currently keeping a list of these newspapers we know existed. I will be happy to provide this list to anyone who can help. My email address is there on the screen. What we at the ASA are asking for is that the history community band together to find these missing papers. And many of them may be in someone's attic or in the archives of a museum. We ask that everyone take on the responsibility for recapturing this historic resource. We fear that in many of these cases, the hour is long past. The papers simply no longer exist. But we have faith that there are at least a few on this list that are salvageable. So we call on the history community to search those attics and those museum storehouses. Let's find these papers before they're lost forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Our next presenter is Darren Bell. Up to bat.
Hi. Newspapers are an excellent resource to document the daily life of within a community. Newspapers are an excellent resource to document the daily happenings of a community within the broader context of an historical event or time period. For instance, and the purposes of this presentation, they document the impact of the growth of women's influence in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly through organizing around topics such as suffrage or social problems that impacted domestic life. This presentation will exhibit how the Pulaskian is a fine example of demonstrating the growth in women's influence in Pulaski County between 1915 and 1922. The Pulaskian was started by John Clay Small. He was a Missouri newspaperman who came to Arkansas in 1910 after purchasing the Arkansas Farmer and Homestead. He resided in the town of Pulaski Heights for only a short period of time, believe it or not. City directories show 1914 to 1916, which is short. But he started the paper because Pulaski County is the only county in the country with no newspaper except for the ones in the big city. That was his claim. And just for a little quick background here, this is a map of Pulaski Heights circa 1917, 1920. It comes from Francis Blaisdell's map of Little Rock. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. I just thought I'd started the video. I apologize for that. So, can everyone see me now?
We can see you.
Okay. So here is a picture of John Small. And here's a picture of and let me get back to this. Here's a map of Pulaski Heights from Francis Blaisdell's map of Little Rock, 1917. And a map of Pulaski County and where Pulaski Heights actually is within Little Rock. I'm going to jump ahead just a little, and I apologize, but this is a great quote to summarize what the Pulaskian really was between 1915 and 1929. The Pulaskian is essentially rural and suburban and does not in any way appeal to the same clientele as that of the metropolitan dailies. It covered stories of Pulaski County and the communities that make up Pulaski County that the Democrat or the Gazette just did not cover. And the Pulaskian was a niche newspaper. It was niche for Pulaski Heights and the community of Pulaski Heights and Pulaski County. The next slide will show a list of associate editors, as they were called, folks who contributed to the paper. And this is just the list changed from week to week, year to year, and a map of Pulaski County where you can see some of these communities, such as Natural Steps, North Point, Warsaw, Galloway, Sweet Home. This is the type of newspapers and communities that the Pulaskian covered. Here's a picture of the inaugural issue, and here's where we get to the meat of the presentation. Frances Ross, in her 1991 AHQ article, "The New Women as Clubwomen and Social Activists in the Turn of 20th Century Arkansas," talks about the new woman being at the turn of the 20th century, who combined the Victorian domestic affairs with social activism to change the world in the image of the home. They did this through club life, through the women's clubs, and women were typically middle class, white, married, living in the cities, and with respectable families and community connections. The clubs were moderate, non-militant, and they represented the middle and professional class of women. They covered topics anywhere on a range of the spectrum of literature, current events, public health and cleanliness, or children's issues, just to name a few. Here again is an inaugural issue, and if you look, and I've highlighted and I brought in a closer view of the top left-hand corner where you see where the Hillcrest Health Club makes the inaugural front page. These are lists of the women's health clubs that are mentioned in the Pulaskian from 1915 to 1916, 1917, and even further. Hillcrest, Pulaski Heights, and Elmhurst. Their name of the presidents and their husbands professions. Some of these names may look familiar, but I show this to show that this really was a middle class and upper class association and way to get involved in civic life. They had and they collaborated with men a lot of the times to get things done. Here we have an article of the Pulaski Heights Women's Club, and the men that helped them do the cleanup of Hillcrest. And at this time in Pulaski Heights, there is the question. Pulaski Heights is developing. They're about to be annexed by Little Rock, and they need infrastructure. They need infrastructure in the worst way. One of the goals of the Hillcrest Health Club was cleanliness and cleaning up Hillcrest. One place that really needed cleaning up was this ravine right here around Hillcrest, which today is Allsop Park. Riola Wood's husband, Judge Carroll Wood, was a leading advocate during this time to get sewage infrastructure into the heights and to get some of that out of the ravine. Now, in 1916, John Small sells the Pulaskian to Park Harper News Service. Here are the publishers. I guess it's Park and Cleo Harper. Here's a list of their publications right here. Cleo Harper was a very well-respected man in Little Rock. He served in civic and professional organizations, even served as the city councilman for the first ward of Little Rock. I showed you their quote earlier where they talked about where the Pulaskian was essentially urban and suburban and rural. And they make their focus more rural than they do suburban, although Pulaski Heights is well covered in their paper. One of the big stories that they covered throughout 1917 and 1918, and it really going forward, are the community clubs of Pulaski County, formed under the direction of the Little Rock Federation of Women's Club, the Board of Commerce, and the Arkansas Farm Bureau. And it just so happens that Cleo Harper's wife was the president of the Little Rock Federation of Women, and the Pulaskian became their official newspaper. So thus you have the coverage, and you have readership going into the next few years. You have a reliable readership. Next, I want to talk about the suffrage movement. This is the other big story during this time period that you see regarding women in the Pulaskian. We have a debate here between two people, a man and a woman, looking to talk about the pros and cons of suffrage. And the interesting thing is that Emanuel Rosenstein doesn't live in Little Rock or Pulaski Heights, but actually lives in Memphis. So you're right, but Zilla Ward is from the first ward of Little Rock, and they present your typical suffrage arguments. Women need to keep Rosenstein was arguing women need to stay out of politics. Women need to reserve their, follow their husband who's in terms of politics and policy. Women who's going to enforce the who's going to enforce the laws. Are women going to do it? And Zilla Rose will give you your stereotypical women's response of, we have our opinions and we'd like to share them. One name that comes up frequently in the suffrage discussion in Pulaski Heights, in the Pulaskian, is Elizabeth Stacy, otherwise known as Mrs. Martin Lee Stacy. Her husband worked in the railroads, and they actually moved out of Pulaski Heights in 1919 for Oklahoma. She was the secretary for the Little Rock Federation of Women's Clubs, and was very active in the suffrage movement. As you can see here, she promotes Carrie Chapman's visit to Little Rock. She helped organize women voters, and she serves on the hostess committee for the suffrage school. And then one more topic I want to touch on briefly is World War I, because this is going on during the time of the Pulaskian. Women are still organizing. They are selling bonds, and the Pulaskian's covering it. They are training younger women to become medics and to help serve the soldiers coming home. And let me back up for a second, because this is important as well. I forgot to mention that the community clubs that were started by the Little Rock Federation for Pulaski County, they served as a hybrid between a home demonstration club and a civic club, who themselves contributed to the war movement on the home front. We also have stories of women in the county waiting to take over their husband's job while they are gone. Here we have a story of a rural fireman, of a rural postal service worker who his wife's taking over his job while he has gone to war. I want to now, in conclusion, this was a very brief presentation and shows you what the Pulaskian had to offer in terms of women, but the Pulaskian has been digitized, and you can see everything in the Pulaskian with the exception of one issue from 1915 to 1922. Here I've listed their website on our Chronicling America page, and I want to go back to saying that the Pulaskian does show how newspapers how they did show everyday happenings and the community. And we see how women did grow. They became active, and they got to share their influence. I've also added here the Arkansas Heritage webpage, or the Arkansas State Archives webpage, that goes for that talks about all the newspapers that we've digitized. The Pulaskian was digitized in July of 2021, so it's fairly recently put up there. And we will be continuing this for another 2 years. I think that is it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Darren and Brian and Katie, for your presentations. Okay, interestingly enough, I've showed up on the screen with a black bar through my eyes. Interesting indeed. At any rate, let me go through and pass on some questions and comments. The first comment from Mark Christ, a familiar name. There should be Encyclopedia of Arkansas entries on these newspapers and editors. He commented on this.
I don't know about the editors, but the papers that we are putting on Chronicling America, we're also writing Encyclopedia of Arkansas articles on those papers. And so we're kind of sending along those to Guy Lancaster and his staff, and they're going to be working on those.
There are also essays to go along with every paper that we digitize on Chronicling America. So in addition to seeing all the papers, you can read about, I think it's about 500 words. You can read about them as well there.
Okay. And Heather says, well, just made a start with a list on the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. So good work. Suzanne Huff has a question. Katie, the two editors, Mary and Kate, helped the suffrage movement immensely, correct?
I mean, I would say yes. I would say possibly more so Kate than Mary. Though someone could contradict me. I know that Kate was involved with Susan B. Anthony in terms of she visited the offices. There were occasional guest writers. I think Susan wrote occasionally for the paper, and also Clara McDermott was very close with them. So I would say they definitely were influential, at least in Arkansas.
Okay. We have an extended comment here from Wendy Plotkin, who presented earlier today. I'm going to condense it a trifle. Arkansas weekly newspapers increasingly had women publishers, editors, and city editors over the course of the 20th century, enough for the Arkansas press women to organize in 1949. Digitizing the newspapers published during their tenure is important as well, as their female voices often affected the content and tone of the newspapers, sometimes in columns or in the editorial policy or the choice of news coverage. Although the female voice was more muted by the need to appeal to the general reading public, they were more likely to survive because of the larger circulations. What are the limitations in terms of digitizing and making available papers?
It would need to be something that we have access to in the first place. Do we, is it something that we have here in our collection? I don't know which papers specifically we might be talking about, but that would be the very first hurdle. Can we find those papers? Do we have access to those papers? Do they meet the minimum requirements?
And also, what about copyright considerations?
Yes, anything after 1927, I believe is where we are. Obviously, copyright becomes an issue at that point.
Okay.
But if you have titles you want to know about, let us know. Maybe we haven't thought of them. We do have a board we work with who helps us make decisions about which titles to select for the project.
Okay, a question for Brian from Suzanne Hoff. Brian, who was the African-American woman pictured earlier? Can't recall her name.
That was Ida B. Wells Barnett.
Okay, and what? How would you encapsulate her fame?
Well, she wrote a lot. She was kind of an activist as far as trying to crusade against lynching in the South, and just kind of overall for the rights of African Americans.
Yeah. As I recall, didn't she contribute to the coverage in the African American press of the Elaine massacre?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. She was pretty instrumental in getting the true facts, that were kind of being ignored.
And she was one of the founding members, as I recall, of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Yeah.
As well, there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay. See, now question here, another question from Wendy Plotkin. I believe that Pulaski Heights was the Little Rock area most likely to have racial deed restrictions in the first half of the 20th century before the Supreme Court ruled against their unenforceability in 1948. Were these racial deed restrictions discussed in the Pulaskian? Over to you, Darren.
They were not, but you see in advertisements in the Little Rock Daily newspapers, the Democrat and the Gazette, where you have whites only, no African Americans. There was a small African American community in West Rock. It was actually part of Pulaski Heights. I think Sherry Nichols probably rightly says that it was more likely a community of servants who would come into Pulaski Heights proper from West Rock. The Hillcrest Health Club and Carol and Riola Wood actually helped plan cleanup days for West Rock as well, and and got the African American community involved. The Pulaskian also covered plenty of African American news from rural Pulaski County, and it wasn't just negative news. It was the daily happenings going on in these small communities, which was a little surprising considering the background, some of the controversial history of Cleo Harper and his connections with the Ku Klux Klan. But news is news.
Okay. We have two more comments. One more from Wendy Plotkin, who mentions one title, the Marked Tree Tribune, and we do have it. Exclamation point. So that I assume this is a paper that had a woman editor. And another comment from Suzanne Huff. Darren, women finally got the right to vote after they took their husbands' jobs during wartime. Thanks for this information.
You're very welcome.
Okay. I see no further comments or questions in our chat columns. Let me remind our listeners, if you have questions or simply interested in the work of the National Digital Newspaper Project, contact us here at the archives. We have people here who will be very happy to talk to you, give you more information than you thought possible about this ongoing enterprise, which is proving already to be a rich trove of information for researchers, both professional and folks who just want to goof around looking at old stuff. So thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow.